This is from YouTube listener Ewan Malone 4839, who says, why is it the fashion now for the most important figures in British politics to be drawn out over culture skirmishes that are frankly beneath their station? For example, our Prime Minister backing a JK Rowling post on X about Hamza Yousaf's Hate Crime and Public Order Act, our leader of the opposition rushing to the Sun over a graphic on the back of an overpriced football jersey. I could go on. So let's just introduce what the Hate Crime and Public Order Act is, just in case our listeners haven't been following. This is a new piece of legislation that's just come into force in Scotland, years in the making, very controversial. Rachel, can you just explain a little about why it's been such a contentious issue?
Well, it broadens hate crime law and enables the police or gives the police powers to investigate language or statements that could be inciting hate, as opposed to the current situation, which is speech that incites violence. And there has been a lot of concern that it could lead to police investigating people for offensive Twitter comments, particularly on the very contentious issue of trans rights and gender identity. There's been some questions over whether misgendering someone, refusing to use the name or pronouns that they choose for themselves, could count as a hate incident under this law. And JK Rowling, who is obviously lives in Scotland, as soon as the law came in, sent a whole load of tweets misgendering various transgender individuals deliberately, and to sort of say to the police, come and arrest me. Police Scotland have said that they're not going to arrest her, and that doesn't breach the law. But there has been some confusion, even among SNP politicians, about what exactly counts or doesn't count over the law. And there are free speech campaigners who are a bit concerned, regardless of whether they agree with these comments or not, that giving the police extra powers to investigate in this space could backfire or lead to people sort of facing police action for just insults, essentially. It is controversial. I do think it's kind of weird that Rishi Sunak immediately jumped on it and decided to, I stand with JK Rowling over it, given that it doesn't really affect him. And you'd think as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, he had a couple of other things to worry about.
Yes. And I should say, when we speak to Chris Deeran, our Scotland editor, we'll talk more about how the act is playing out on the ground and what the implications are. But to answer our listeners' question, we should talk about sort of why we think Rishi Sunak is, I think it was when he was on a visit to a nursery trying to sell his new childcare policy, wasn't it? But he was weighing in on some Scottish legislation brought in by a government that, isn't run by the same party as him, and doesn't really have England in its scope. So is that, him trying to get involved in what this lovely phrase that our questioner has given us, culture skirmish?
Oh, definitely. And I think the reason that he's doing it and that Conservatives are doing it, although Labour is also doing it too, is culture wars are cheap. We've talked about this before, that if there isn't lots of money and people are complaining about NHS waiting lists and energy bills and crumbling infrastructure and sewage or whatever, and you say, yes, but, you can trust us to stand up for British values, and you can trust us to know what a woman is, and you can trust us to save our history curriculum or whatever. You can say all of that stuff, and it gives you something to say without having to spend any money. And it's not new at all. My favourite example of this, I think, was a couple of years ago, back when Gavin Williamson was Education Secretary, which is just a sentence that I still find very bizarre. He was Education Secretary at a time when schools were still recovering from COVID. They were asking for more money over catch-up funding. Universities were in crisis. They're still in crisis. There were a lot of issues that Gavin Williamson could have been working on as Education Secretary, and he decided to wade in on the fact that a tiny group of students at one specific Oxford college, not even like the main students, but like specifically masters and postgraduate students, had voted to take down a portrait of the Queen in their common room. And Gavin Williams was like, this is outrageous, this is an attack on British values. And it was fairly obvious that it was to give him something to say so he could avoid answering all the questions about school catch-up funding and COVID loaning and all of that stuff.
Yeah, it's a very good deflection from difficult policy areas, isn't it? Because the other example we've been given from our person who sent in the question was about Keir Starmer talking to The Sun about how he didn't agree with this rebrand of the St George's Cross on the England strip. I think in the question it says he rushed to The Sun. I think he was actually doing an interview anyway, wasn't he? And it came up. But you did have this faintly ridiculous situation where, Labour politician after Labour politician on the media rounds were happy, all too happy to comment on this thing, which was essentially a sort of stealth marketing campaign for Nike, rather than answering questions on what some people would really like to hear them on, selling arms to Israel as a recent example, because it really does allow them to A, not make spending commitments, and B, sort of hide behind the issue of the day, rather than actually answering questions on policy areas that are a bit more difficult for them. But it can backfire, though, because do you remember during the Euros 3 years ago, and you had sort of Conservative politicians, senior ones, Priti Patel when she was Home Secretary, happy to talk about taking the knee. And she said, it was fine for fans to boo the England team when they took the knee. And that did backfire because it wasn't really in tune with the public mood at the time. And I remember, when some of the black players on the team received racist abuse, they then said, well, one of them, Tyrone Mings, said she'd stoked the fire by giving licence to fans to boo them for that symbolic gesture of solidarity with Black Britons. So I think they were out of touch with the national feeling in that sense. And when they were taking pictures of themselves in England shirts cheering on the team, it did seem disingenuous. So there is a risk to it.
Yeah, and I think it can always backfire. I think politicians need to remember that celebrities, particularly footballers, but also, singers, film stars, whatever, are a lot more popular than they are. People generally like celebrities more than they like politicians. So if they're going to wade in and criticise celebrities for supporting a cause, that celebrity has got to that position because an awful lot of people like them. I think it's you can draw similar parallels with what's going on with Taylor Swift in the US and Donald Trump's kind of campaign on her. I think football is a particularly explosive one because it's a real part of our national identity, and politicians use the feel-good feeling when our football teams are doing well as to kind of everything's going great. Look, we could be really proud of Britain. And so to wade into that row and criticise them, put them in a really awkward position. I think football is also why Keir Starmer, who is a football fan, he's an Arsenal fan, his comment on the shirts, I think there's actually a bit more going on there specifically because part of Keir Starmer's revamping of Labour's brand is to signal to sort of the working class communities that Labour lost in 2019, that it's safe and you can come back to Labour, and this is somebody who actually is proud of Britain, England, and does share their values and does care about football in a way that there was a sense that Labour in the last kind of decade or so hasn't really had that vibe to it. So I think it was quite calculating for him to make that comment on the football shirt. And it was weird though, because you had all three main parties going united in the fact they didn't like the flag on the Nike shirt that was like a commercial decision at a time when there was quite a lot of other stuff going on.
Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.